The one step that an impulsive artist such as myself hates is the pencil sketch. That's why today we're going to skip over that sketch and do a better, funner version of that. And we're going to be using Holbein Acrylic Gouache paint. These are the colors we're going to be using, and this is what we're going to be using to sketch. I'm going to be showing you a version of sketching that's low risk and easy to do. We're going to be using a very watered down acrylic paint to do the first initial sketches and then go over it with an opaque, more dense color. The point is to make more free, abstract illustrations, and any mistakes in proportions will be fixed later with the opaque coloring in or painting in. Here I'm showing you how watered down your first initial sketches should be. This will help you get the basic shapes and proportions correctly before you move on to detail. Now remember, we don't want too much detail just yet. We will be painting that later on. I'm going to show you how rendering later on fixes a lot of the mistakes that you make in the initial sketch. And for this illustration today, I chose to draw a very sneaky tomato and a very sneaky little bok choy who likes to gossip in the vegetable garden. Out of everything I could have drawn, why did I choose a tomato? I like the shape and I like the color of a tomato. That's pretty much it. I'm drawing little radishes, which later on turn out to be little onions. That's the magic of drawing or painting with acrylic gouache rather than watercolor. You can always go over it and you can always change details and even change characters for that matter. And as you can see, you can treat it like watercolor too if you water it down. You also don't have to worry too much about the integrity of the acrylic paint because this is the initial sketch and it'll be covered over anyways with opaque color. And for the sake of saving time, I slowly, gradually add the gradients that I want instead of adding it on to a second layer. You're going to see how I add little bits here and there of orange and then a little bit of a lighter orange to yellows just to give it that flowy gradient effect on the tomato so it's not just one basic color. This method is also probably one of the easiest ways to blend colors in together. When the paint is wet, it's very easy to blend together. Now when you add a different layer onto it, it can be a little bit tricky. Now you don't have to necessarily add a gradient effect, but that's just my style and what I like to do with my paintings. You can of course do a basic all over color. Now aside from adding oranges to the red to make it a little bit of more vibrant, lighter colors where the light is hitting it, in the shadows I added a little bit of browns. And at this section, it's a little bit drier already, so I'm going to add a little bit of reds and slowly, gradually go into the reds that was in the first layer. Now to create shadows, you can diffuse it like this, or you could just add a line and make it more of a contrast. I also darkened the shade a little bit for the blush, and of course did brown for the eyeliner. Now for this tomato, I added two leaves. One of them was olive green and the other was a little bit lit back, and that is a brown shade. As far as my process goes, I like to make sure that the characters are very opaque and bright, and then the rest of the background and details that don't necessarily matter as much or shouldn't be in focus as much, I like to water it down a little bit. This creates almost like a watercolor effect in the background, and it's really nice in contrast with the main subject. If you pay close attention, you'll be able to see that further on in the video. Now, I really wanted this tomato to pop out, so in the background, I did a light wash of blue. This helps provide an undertone and give that blue tint to the rest of the things in the background. Now, the way that I achieve this is by significantly watering down the paint. Remember to let this layer dry completely. So here's another tip. I'm a very impatient artist and brushstrokes mean everything. By mastering your brushstrokes, you learn that a little goes a long way. And what I mean by that is that pushing down on the brush creates a wider array of coverage. The angle of the brush to the paper allows for thin strokes and thicker strokes, more coverage thus allowing you to cover more space in one stroke. This also helps if you want to create a matte even finish with very little texture. On a side note, I like the contrast between the dark and the light of the leaves, or the little hands and feet. These little string arms and legs reminds me of the animation for Over the Garden Wall. Maybe I was subconsciously inspired by that. I was also pretty happy with the wide smile and the little moon eyes. Now you can't really see in the video, and I do apologize for that, but I did add a little bit of misty blue around the smile just to give it a little bit of definition, and also in the eyes. I only ever really use whites for very, very small details. Things like teeth and even the eyes should never be completely white. Try using a light gray or a misty blue for that. I'm going to show you how I blend the colors in the bok choy. Since I'm obsessed with the gradient effect again, I'm going to show you how I blend that easily so that you don't have to worry or be stressed about it. Now, the key to working with acrylic gouache and blending and creating gradients is to work pretty fast and not allow the paint to dry. But if you can't work fast enough, you can also apply a second layer of the color that's similar to it and then water it down so it diminishes into that other color. On a side note, I feel very anxious when I have to draw larger amounts of spaces, like these leaves, for example, and I think that's why I go and aim for gradient effects rather than just a large block of one color. It not only helps my anxiety, but it also creates a beautiful effect, and that's kind of what I'm going for. So 2 wins, 2 birds with 1 stone. You'll see that I add different shades and colors to each leaf, and that's just to create interest. Also, make sure to add a little bit of a darker shade to the edges so people can differentiate between objects. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to tell my leaves apart from a giant blob. I don't add a lot of details to the leaves other than these lines and strokes, but I really don't add too much details to it, and that's fine. Not everything needs to be overworked. I'm slowly learning not to overwork a painting and just focus on the main characters and the main details. So here we're actually painting the little cloves of garlic. I'm generally using a tinted white, more like a grayish, and a pink color to add the shadows. And wherever there's a deeper shadow, I add a darker shade of pink. Since this is more of a side character, I just added little dots to create eyes and less expression on the face altogether. Here's one of the instances where I do add plain white to create very tiny little details and specks. And the reason why I decided to add pure white is simply because you wouldn't be able to see the contrast if I added a misty blue. Same thing as the little wrinkles in the bok choy. As far as these strings of asparagus in the background, I really didn't know where I was going with this, so I added a first layer of this tone of blue or green, but then as you see, I go a little bit more of an olive tone. And again, I use the same strategies to blend the colors together and create that smooth gradient. I also didn't worry too much about the other side of the asparagus, and that's because it's less important. So I actually watered down the paint a little bit and just did more of an olive green on the other side. You'll see. When I'm doing the little leaves in the asparagus, I just try to find a color that contrasts, and then I work my way with complementary colors on the back ends and on the front ends. So I just alternate from different shades basically, and that just gives it definition and gives it interest. Now that's my personal style, but you could actually add different colors that aren't necessarily natural, like pink, for example. I added 2 little stringy hands on the bok choy because he's just supposed to be relaxed. I guess he just told tomatoes something and tomatoes finding it funny. Now at this point I thought I was still drawing radishes, but you'll see later on in the video I actually turn them into onions. This was more of an artistic choice rather than a story choice. It didn't really matter to me what they were. As long as they made sense with the overall picture, I was pretty happy. Now in this case, because it's a smaller space, I just added basic blocks of color. I alternated between oranges and pinks just to make it a little more interesting, but you'll see that that doesn't really matter too much because I'll go over it and kind of create a unison. A lot of times when I look at illustrations that really catch my eye, the proportions don't necessarily make sense, but the texture, the vibrancy, and the overall piece and choice of colors is what brings the illustration to life. Take, for example, illustrations in children's book. Now, this is very important because children's books are made to look almost like if a child itself had drawn it, in some cases, not all. Now, in this portion of the painting, I wanted to show you how I use the wet on dry technique. This is when I wet the paper and then I add paint into it. This diffuses the paint and gives it a watercolor faded effect. A little more on that later. Now, because the lettuce leaves are moved way back in the background, I'm gonna make them less conspicuous. And the way that I do that is by watering down the paint and creating a watercolor effect. So in my case, in my style, the further down an object is, the more watered down, more watercolor style effect it looks. Generally speaking, there is a transparency to the leaves of cabbages and lettuces, so this watercolor effect actually works well. I also add different tonal effects to it. By the way, here's another nugget. The further things are, the more blue or lighter they appear. Okay, let me hush for a sec and let you see that process. Because lettuce has different variations, I'm gonna add little specks of yellow and little darker specks all over the different leaves just to have cohesiveness and to have interest, and also to add texture. I did the same by adding this layer to the little radishes, which later become onions. And these are things that generally the eye doesn't pick on as far as the viewer looking at this picture, but they are important and they create interest. And yes, those are little white beady eyes. A lot of times I work back and forth, and you can see here that I use a very watered down paint to create leaves and just to create little objects here and there to add interest to the background. Now remember when I was talking about the wet and dry technique? Here's an example where you water down the paper and then you add paint to it as it diffuses. It creates a really cool effect. And this is when I start adding streaks to the radishes and it slowly becomes onions. And the sole reason for that is that I saw another reference picture and I liked how the onions looked and I thought it would look better in the painting. Now this is one of my favorite parts, which is adding highlights to the painting. In this case, I barely used any water, and as you can see with the orange highlights, it was dry brush, so that's basically straight from the tube. And of course I had to add the little stars just to make it very childlike and very sparkly. Here is where we make the final details with a colored pencil. Now I have to say, as far as me and the process that I like, I don't like depending on colored pencils very much. I only use them for very small details here and there because generally I just enjoy painting with gouache. I don't know if everybody else is the same way. Well, probably not, because there's people that do colored pencils. Well, not do colored pencils, do colored pencil drawings. But I find the act of coloring just a little bit tedious and a little bit of a hard labor. I guess I like the feel of the smoothness of painting. And here is where I go ahead and strip that tape. This tape is Scotch masking tape, and it's actually fairly inexpensive rather than using washi tape. It also peels very well, but here's a tip. Use this type of angle when you're peeling the tape. If you move your hand upright and too far away from the paper, it actually causes it to rip. Just remember, keep your finger very close to that paper. Now here is the finished product of the illustration. It's rather simple, yet not that simple. It's actually kind of complex. But as you can see, it's not overworked and still sends the message. I think once you master basic skills like the brush strokes and things like that, you're able to focus on more intuitive skills. You know, such things such as focus. I hope I was able to show you how you don't have to make a perfectly rendered sketch to come up with a pretty cool and complete illustration. So I hope I helped you guys out a little bit. Anyways, keep on painting.